In the year 1846, America was dreaming westward. The land beyond the horizon shimmered like a promise, a paradise carved from dust and faith. California was the word on every tongue, a beacon for the bold, a vision for the desperate. They said it was a land where the soil was gold, where the trees bore fruit in winter, where a man could start again and become the master of his fate. And so they came. Hundreds of families, wagons creaking over the prairie, their eyes full of light. They came for freedom. They came for fortune. They came for destiny. But one group would discover the other side of that dream. A company of 87 souls who would find not paradise, but the edge of human endurance. Their story would become a legend, a curse whispered through the generations. Their name would stain the snow. They would be known as the Donner Party. They began in the spring of 1846 in Springfield, Illinois, a tidy frontier town at the edge of the known world. 87 pioneers gathered there, farmers, carpenters, merchants, mothers with infants, children who still thought the world was kind. They hitched their wagons, loaded their hopes, and turned their faces west toward California. At their head was George Donner, 62 years old, respected, practical, steady. He was not a man of wild ambition but of quiet strength, chosen by consensus to lead. Beside him rode James Reed, younger, confident, and ambitious. Reed had read a new book by a man named Lansford Hastings. It claimed to hold the key to the future, a new route to California that cut straight across the mountains, faster and easier than any before. The Hastings Cutoff. No wagon train had ever crossed it. No one truly knew where it led. But the idea of a shortcut, of beating the odds, thrilled the restless hearts of the westward dreamers. They trusted the promise more than the proof. And so, the Donner Party turned toward destiny and disaster. The early journey was almost idyllic. The plains stretched endless and green beneath a summer sky. The wind whispered through tall grass, and the sound of wheels and laughter carried across the open land. Children chased butterflies. Men sang. Women tended fires under the evening stars, believing that God himself smiled upon their courage. But by the time the wagons reached Fort Bridger, deep in the Wyoming wilderness, the illusion of safety had begun to fray. At the fort, they met Lansford Hastings himself, the author of the guidebook, the prophet of their path. He was charming, confident, persuasive. He promised that his new route, though little traveled, was safe, direct, and shorter than the traditional Oregon Trail. He gave them a letter of assurance, sealed with his word. It was all they needed. Trust, faith, and a dream too bright to question. The Donner Party followed Hastings into the mountains. What awaited them was not a shortcut, but a trial by earth and sky. The Wasatch Mountains rose ahead, steep, treacherous, and uncharted. The trail vanished beneath rock and forest. Wagons splintered against stone. Men fell to their knees, heaving ropes and swearing under the merciless sun. 4 days of struggle turned into 2 weeks of torment. The oxen collapsed. The women walked barefoot through mud, bleeding and silent. Each mile cost them time, strength, and sanity. When they finally descended from the Wasatch Range, the Great Salt Lake Desert lay waiting, a white, blinding sea of salt stretching beyond sight. Hastings' shortcut led straight into it. They entered the desert believing it could be crossed in 2 days. By the 5th, their water was gone. By the 6th, their oxen fell where they stood, tongues blackened by thirst. The wheels of their wagons sank into the shimmering crust of salt. Children cried for water that did not exist. Their mothers' tears turned to dust before they reached the ground. At night, the heat gave way to cold so sharp it stole their breath. For 5 days and nights, they dragged themselves across that white abyss, delirious and dying. When they reached the far side, the desert behind them shimmered like a vision of hell. 32 oxen lay dead. Wagons broken, weeks lost, hope bleeding. It was late August. Winter was already whispering over the peaks. By October, the party's unity began to crumble. Fatigue bred anger, hunger bred hatred. And then the blood came. James Reed and John Snyder, 2 men once bound by hardship, quarreled on the trail. Exhaustion turned words to shouts, shouts to blows. Snyder struck Reed. Reed, blinded by rage, drew his knife. When the violence ended, Snyder lay dying in the dirt. The others gathered to pass judgment. Some demanded Reed's execution. Others argued for mercy. At last they banished him, exiled him into the wilderness alone. He rode ahead toward California, leaving behind his wife and children among the wagons. The Donner Party moved on, fractured and frightened. Each mile grew colder, each sunrise darker. In late October, they reached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, the last barrier between them and California's Golden Valleys. Only a few days' journey remained, but the mountains did not wait. On October 28, 1846, the first blizzard struck. The storm came without warning, a curtain of white swallowing the trail, the trees, the world itself. Snow fell thick and fast, blinding and silent. The wagons froze where they stood. The oxen stumbled and vanished beneath the drifts. Within hours, the path to California was gone. They were trapped. The survivors built crude cabins near Truckee Lake, what would one day be known as Donner Lake. They felled trees with numb hands, packed cracks with mud, and prayed that the storm would pass. But it did not. The Donners, delayed by broken wagons, camped 6 miles back at Alder Creek, their tents buried in snow. The mountains closed around them. The sky turned white and still. The wilderness swallowed their names. The food ran out first. Then the animals. Then the leather of their boots, boiled into bitter soup that stank of despair. They chewed bark. They gnawed bones. They stared at one another in the dim firelight, too weak to speak, too proud to beg. Each morning brought another corpse. Each night brought another prayer unanswered. In one cabin, a woman wept quietly as she held her dead child. In another, a man watched the fire die and wondered which would go first, his wife or his mind. The air inside the cabins grew thick with the smell of rot and smoke. The world outside was silent but for the wind. Tamsin Donner wrote in her journal, "The snow is falling fast. We have not tasted bread for many weeks." The snow rose higher than the cabins. The horizon disappeared. The sound of wind against the trees became the only reminder that time was still moving. Then came the whispers. The kind that begin as horror and end as reason. The first to die, they said, would feed the living. At first they denied it. Then they prayed against it. But hunger has a voice that drowns all others. When the cold claimed another child, when the bodies froze beside the living, the choice ceased to be a question. And so it began. They carved the flesh of the dead. They cooked it in silence. They wept as they ate. They asked forgiveness of a God who had gone quiet. In the cabins, the line between man and beast blurred. Outside, the snow fell, merciful and blind, covering the evidence of what survival demanded. By December, 15 of the strongest among them resolved to make one last attempt to reach help. They fashioned crude snowshoes and stepped into the white wilderness. Men and women together, exhausted, starved, half dead before they began. They became known as the Forlorn Hope. For days they trudged through waist-deep snow. The wind cut their faces raw. Their feet froze black. Nights brought nightmares that bled into waking. They sang hymns to keep madness at bay. By the 5th day, they stopped singing. By the 7th, they stopped praying. When the first among them died, they hesitated. But starvation leaves little room for hesitation. The dead became food. The living consumed the flesh of their companions. Tears froze on their cheeks as they chewed. There was no pleasure, only survival and shame. After 3 weeks of torment, 7 survivors stumbled into a Native American village, half mad and near death. They carried news of horror. Behind them, the Donner Party still waited, buried alive beneath the snow. It was February 1847 when the first rescue team reached Donner Lake. They arrived to a landscape of silence and decay. Cabins sagged beneath the weight of snow. Bodies lay half frozen in the drifts. Inside, the living stared back with hollow eyes. At Alder Creek, they found George Donner, dying, his body consumed by infection. Beside him, his wife Tamsin refused to leave. She stayed with him until the end. When rescuers returned, her body was gone. At the lake, they found Louis Kieseberg, alive, alone, surrounded by the dead. A pot simmered by the fire. Inside, the rescuers found human remains. When they questioned him, he said little. Some believed he had killed to survive. Others believed the dead had offered themselves to his hunger. The truth was buried in snow and silence. 4 rescue parties came over the next 2 months. Each one found fewer survivors. Each one lost men to the mountains on the way back. The blizzards did not stop, as though the land itself wanted to keep what it had taken. When the last survivors were brought down, 48 remained of the original 87 who had left Illinois. The rest were gone, consumed by the cold, by hunger, by the terrible necessity of life. When spring came and the thaw began, searchers found bones scattered across the camps. Bones cracked open, hollow where the marrow had been drawn. The name Donner became a shiver on the lips of America. A warning. A curse. But beneath the horror lay something deeper, the mirror of the human soul. They were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were simply people, stripped of illusion, caught between faith and the frost. The wilderness did not kill them. It revealed them. And when the snow melted and the green returned to the valleys, the mountains held their silence. The land remembered. The wind remembered. And every winter since, when snow falls over Donner Lake, it falls like ashes, as if the earth itself still mourns those who came too late. When the snow began to melt, the Sierra Nevada revealed what winter had hidden. The rescuers who returned to the mountains in March 1847 did not find the hopeful pioneers who had once set out from Illinois. They found death, and something beyond death. The cabins stood like tombs, half buried in ice, their roofs sagging under the thaw. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay. Flesh clung to bone, pale and stiff. Children's toys lay in the corners, their colors fading beneath soot and blood. The snow outside was streaked with black from old fires. Bones lay scattered near the doorways. Human bones, cracked open for marrow. The rescuers did not speak. They only stared, because there were no words for what they saw. The land was quiet now, almost gentle, as if ashamed of what it had done. The sun shone. Birds returned to the branches, the lake shimmered under the thaw. But beneath that beauty, the silence screamed. 48 survivors had made it out of the mountains. 39 were dead. Their names spread across the newspapers like an accusation. The nation wanted to look away, but could not. This was the price of manifest destiny. Not glory, not gold, but flesh and madness in the snow. The story spread eastward like wildfire. The Donner Party, devoured by their own. People whispered in saloons and parlors, in towns and churches, wondering how it could happen, how civilization could vanish so quickly, how men and women could fall so far from grace. But those who judged had never faced a winter like that. They had never known hunger so deep it gnawed through bone. The survivors carried the memories with them, ghosts that never left. James Reed, once banished as a murderer, became their savior. When the snow trapped the party, he had fought his way to California, nearly starving himself. He rallied rescue expeditions, men with courage enough to face the storms again and again. Without him, none would have lived. Yet even his redemption was haunted. He saved his family, but not all his friends. And at night, when the wind howled through the California hills, he heard the echo of that first blizzard and the screams it carried. The Breen family, who had huddled together through the worst of it, emerged alive but broken. They spoke little of the months in the cabins. Patrick Breen's diary survived, a grim record of suffering written in a trembling hand. Each entry grew shorter as his strength waned. Each word carried the weight of despair. Cold, snowing fast, hungry. Mrs. Murphy says the wolves are about. We pray for relief. And then, silence. Some families rebuilt. Some vanished. But all were changed. Louis Kieseberg, the last man found alive at the lake, became the story's living curse. Rumors said he had murdered Tamsin Donner for her flesh, that he had eaten the hearts of children, that he had laughed when the rescuers came. He denied it. He claimed he only survived as others had, by doing what hunger demanded. But in the eyes of the world, his denial meant nothing. He became the face of the tragedy, the monster the newspapers needed. The name, Kesseberg, became a hiss on every street. He tried to live quietly afterward, running a tavern in California, but the whispers followed him. Children threw stones at his door. Men spat when he passed. No matter what he said, no matter how he lived, he could not wash the blood from his name. He died old, alone, still protesting that he had done only what he must to survive. No one believed him. But perhaps they should have. Because the truth was crueler than the rumors. Not that they had become monsters, but that they had remained human while doing monstrous things. They had felt shame. They had prayed over the dead before they ate them. They had wept afterward. They had not lost their souls. They had carried them through the fire. The Sierra Nevada remained beautiful that spring, radiant, vast, eternal. But those who had walked through it knew the beauty was a mask. Behind it lay a truth older than man, that nature does not care who lives or dies. The wilderness had not punished them. It had simply revealed them. When news of the tragedy reached the eastern states, America trembled. The newspapers printed every gruesome detail: bones, starvation, cannibalism. Some papers called them savages. Others called them victims. And for a time, the dream of the West dimmed. Families hesitated before hitching their wagons. Men looked at maps with new doubt. But dreams die slowly. Within a few years, others followed the same path. The graves were still fresh, but the land still called. The Donner Party became a warning, but also a symbol. Not of failure, but of the cost of ambition. They were the embodiment of the American hunger, a hunger so vast it devours itself. In time, the survivors scattered. Children grew up and married. Some tried to forget, but memory is a thing that does not forgive. Virginia Reed, daughter of James Reed, once wrote a letter to a friend back east. She said, "Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can." It became the simplest, truest lesson born from a winter of horror. George Donner's surviving kin moved to California and lived in quiet obscurity. They never spoke of Alder Creek again. The Breens built a small farm near San Juan Bautista. They attended church, raised children, and prayed for peace. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, Patrick Breen would wake before dawn and stare out at the fog, remembering the sound of snow falling on the cabin roof. Remembering how silence can scream. Years passed. Decades. The mountains reclaimed their calm. The cabins rotted away. Grass grew where bones once lay. The lake reflected the sky again, as though nothing had ever happened. But the land remembered. Travelers who camped near Donner Lake told stories of strange sounds. Whispers in the wind, faint cries that rose with the storm. Some said they saw shapes moving through the snow, carrying lanterns that never burned out. Others heard the creak of wagon wheels when no wagons passed. The place had taken on a soul of its own, cold, watching, unforgotten. Historians came, years later, to measure, to study, to write. They found evidence scattered in the soil: buttons, tools, scraps of clothing, bones bleached white by time. Each artifact whispered the same truth: that civilization is only skin deep, and when the skin is torn away, what lies beneath is hunger. But the Donner story was not simply about death. It was about the fragility of dreams. How easily hope turns to horror when faced with the indifference of nature. How the fire of ambition, once lit, cannot be controlled. It burns until it consumes everything. The wilderness of the West became a stage where countless dreams played out, but none so haunting as the Donner tragedy. It stripped away the myth of manifest destiny and left only the human cost. It showed that courage and folly often wear the same face, and that even the righteous, when starving, will do what must be done. By the late 1800s, new travelers crossed the Sierra Nevada by train. They looked out from warm carriages at the snow-capped peaks and saw beauty, not death. Few remembered that beneath those slopes lay the bones of the past. Fewer still felt the weight of the story. But for those who knew, the sight of that lake brought only silence. The last survivor of the Donner Party died in 1935, more than 80 years after that terrible winter. Her name was Isabella Breen. She was a child when the snow came. In her final years, when asked about it, she spoke softly. "There was so much snow," she said. "So much snow." And nothing more. The story of the Donner Party outlived them all. It became legend, retold in books, in classrooms, around campfires. But with every telling, the edges blurred. The truth softened. People wanted meaning. They wanted heroes and villains. But the truth was simpler, colder. There were no heroes. No villains. Only hunger and the will to live. The Donner Party did not fail to reach California. They reached it too late. And by the time they did, the frontier had already taken its price. In the end, what remained was not horror, but revelation. The tragedy was not that they died, but that they showed what humanity becomes when stripped bare of mercy and comfort. They proved that survival is both sacred and savage, that the line between them is drawn in the snow and easily erased. When winter comes to the Sierra Nevada now, the snow falls softly over the pine trees, burying the trails where the wagons once broke. The lake lies still, dark beneath its frozen skin. And sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, the wind carries a whisper, faint, sorrowful, almost human. It sounds like wagon wheels turning. It sounds like voices calling through the storm. It sounds like a promise broken, echoing forever in the mountains that keep their dead. The land has moved on, but it has not forgotten. The wilderness remembers everything. It remembers the laughter of the children who believed they were bound for paradise. It remembers the screams of the starving when the snow sealed them in. It remembers the prayers, the tears, the silence. And when the first snow falls each year, the earth itself seems to hold its breath, as if honoring the ghosts of that winter, the winter that ate men alive. For the Donner Party was more than a story of death. It was the story of a nation's hunger, for land, for glory, for destiny, and the terrible price of reaching too far. It was a reminder that dreams, like mountains, demand sacrifice, and that beneath the beauty of the frontier, there is always the cold. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, like, and drop a comment below. Your support keeps history alive and helps us bring the next untold story to life.